Hello everybody and welcome to the Introduction to Anatomy and Physiology of the Heart. This video is going to be walking you through the major landmarks and regions of the heart that we want you to know for Bio 162. Now, of course, there's a lot to know about the heart, more so than we're going to be covering in this course, but many of you are going to be going on to your upper division physiology and anatomy courses later on, and you will be diving more into the details of the heart, and it's actually really exciting. I love the heart. So let's go ahead and dive into this a little. Okay, first things first, let's talk about the directionality of the heart. So right off the bat, we are looking right here at the front view of the heart, or the anterior view of the heart. So front, anterior, same. And from our perspective, this appears to be the left side and this appears to be the right side, but it's actually not the case. So if everybody could draw your attention to me in that upper right-hand corner of the screen, if you were to ask me to raise my left arm, from your perspective, this looks like my right side, right? But it's not. This is my left arm. It's the same thing goes with the heart. We refer to the different sides of the heart, left or right, based on how it lies in the body. So in fact, from our perspective, even though this looks like the left side of the heart, this is actually the right side of the heart. And even though this looks like the right side of the heart, this is actually the left side of the heart. But how can we tell that we're actually looking at the front or the anterior view of the heart? Well, I'm going to pull up a picture of the posterior view of the heart. So this is the back of the heart, or the posterior view of the heart. And let me change my pen color here. We're going to choose magenta. And so this is the left side, this is the right side of the heart. Well, how we can tell the difference between the front and the back of the heart is this landmark right here. Doesn't this look like a sash that kind of comes across the body of the front of the heart right here? It starts from the top left side and goes all the way down to the bottom right side of the heart. And this red vessel right here is the left coronary artery. And so, of course, where there is a left coronary artery, there's a right coronary artery over here. None of this you guys need to know, but this is just a really good landmark for being able to distinguish whether or not you're looking at the anterior view or the posterior view. Notice here on the posterior view, you don't have that sash that goes across the side of the heart. Again, that comes across right here, this is where that left coronary artery would be, right there, that separates the left side and the right side. If we were to compare both the anterior view and the posterior view of a preserved heart here, notice again, there's that sash that comes across, but we don't see that sash here on the posterior view of the heart. So that's how you're able to tell the difference between the anterior and the posterior view. And this is going to be your right side of the heart, this is going to be your left side, and again, this is going to be your left side, and this is going to be your right side of the heart. All right, so recall, which side is more muscular, the right or the left side? Well, the left side of the heart is going to be much more thicker than the right side of the heart, because the right side of the heart is only pumping blood to the lungs, whereas the left side of the heart is pumping blood to the entire body. So it needs these thick muscular walls to really pump blood out to the rest of the body. And so the left side has the thickest wall compared to the right side. Okay, let's begin to identify some major landmarks here. So again, this is the frontal view, or rather the anterior view of the heart. We could tell that this is the anterior view of the heart because there is that sash that comes down right here. And these little elephant ear flaps, I think they look like elephant ear flaps, these are known as your auricles. So if this is the right side and this is the left side of the heart, this is going to be your right auricle and this is going to be your left auricle. These are really important for being able to identify where the superior vena cava enters and where that pulmonary vein enters. All right, next I'm gonna change my pen color here. We'll go magenta again. All right, this green arrow is pointing to the tip of the heart. The tip of the heart is known as the apex of the heart. This blue line that just appeared up at the top, this is pointing to the superior vena cava. This is where deoxygenated blood is going to be entering in to the right atrium on the inside of the heart. This light blue arrow is pointing to your aorta, your ascending aorta up here. This is where oxygenated blood is leaving the left ventricle and it's pumping blood to the rest of the body via systemic circulation. And then this red arrow that just popped up right here is pointing to the pulmonary artery. This pulmonary artery is pumping deoxygenated blood from the right ventricle into the lungs so that the lungs get blood to be oxygenated. Okay, so just to drive this concept home, this yellow arrow is pointing to that left coronary artery that comes down into the right side of the heart. I say left coronary artery because there is actually a right coronary artery right here. You don't need to know that. We're not going to ask you to identify the coronary artery, but it's just a good landmark to be able to tell if you're looking at the front or the back of the heart. So this is the right side, this is the left side over there. Okay. So the posterior view of the heart, so the back of the heart. Again, we just went over what this green arrow is pointing to. Can anybody remember what the name of that is called? That is known as the apex of the heart. So that's the point, the very tip of the heart. This blue arrow up here at the top is pointing to your superior vena cava. Remember that deoxygenated blood is going to be entering into the heart, into that right atrium down here via the superior vena cava. And there is an inferior vena cava right here. You are not required to be able to identify that, but it's good to know that if there's a superior vena cava, there's also an inferior vena cava. But again, you're not required to know that. Okay, oh, and there's the blue arrow right there pointing to the inferior vena cava. These red arrows that just popped up right here, these are going to be your pulmonary arteries. These pulmonary arteries bring deoxygenated blood to the lungs so that blood becomes oxygenated. So deoxygenated blood is leaving the right ventricle and leaving the heart via the pulmonary arteries right here. These pulmonary arteries right here make up what's known as the pulmonary trunk. These yellow arrows that just popped up, these are your pulmonary veins. These pulmonary veins are going to be bringing oxygenated blood back into the heart from the lungs. So what we're going to be doing is walking through step by step how blood enters the heart and how it leaves the heart. We're going to be talking about pulmonary circulation. We're going to be talking about systemic circulation. Everything that I am discussing on this slide, everybody should be able to do that by the end of this lab. Okay, here we go. So, deoxygenated blood is going to be entering the superior vena cava. So this is deoxygenated blood entering the superior vena cava of the heart. It is going to travel down into this first chamber right here, known as the right atrium. Remember that there's also an inferior vena cava, but you're not required to know that. After deoxygenated blood is in the right atrium, it passes through our first valve right here. This valve is known as the right atrioventricular valve or the tricuspid valve. Now, you do not have to have both of those names memorized. You can memorize that it is the tricuspid valve. That is just fine. However, if you want to memorize right atrioventricular valve, for some people that's easier because atrioventricular, that tells you exactly where that valve is. It is between the atrium and the ventricle. We will not be accepting right AV valve. You will get partial credit for that. You have to give us direction, whether it's the right or the left one, and you have to spell out this whole word. So the right atrioventricular valve or the tricuspid valve. After that valve, we are now in the right ventricle. This chamber right here will then pump deoxygenated blood out through the second valve everybody needs to know. This is known as the pulmonary semilunar valve. Once we pass through that pulmonary semilunar valve, we are now in the pulmonary trunk of the heart, and this is where deoxygenated blood is leaving via the pulmonary artery. And so it doesn't matter which artery you're choosing to leave out of, no matter what, you're going to the lungs. And when deoxygenated blood goes to the lungs, it becomes oxygenated. And so what we just talked about right here is known as the pulmonary circuit. Okay, so now blood is oxygenated. Where does it go next? So it's going to come back to the heart yet again, and it is going to come back to the heart via the pulmonary vein right here. So oxygenated blood enters the heart via the pulmonary vein into the left atrium. After passing into the left atrium, we're going to pass into our third valve, which is right here. This is known as the left atrioventricular valve, or the bicuspid valve. Once we pass through that valve, we are now in the left ventricle down here. After blood is in the left ventricle, we are going to begin to leave the heart, and we are going to pass through the fourth valve that we need to know here. This is known as the aortic semilunar valve. Once oxygenated blood passes that aortic semilunar valve, we are in the aorta, and from the aorta, blood goes systemic and it goes to the rest of the body, and we are happy. This is known as the systemic circuit. Perfect. Okay, everybody should be able to walk through that step by step, and what really helps to study for that is talking out loud and trying to teach somebody else it. Let's talk a little more. So we are going to be zooming in. Let me erase all this. We're going to be zooming in right in here. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the atrioventricular valves and the semilunar valves. So there is a big difference between the semilunar valves. This is the pulmonary semilunar valve, and this is the aortic semilunar valve. This is your right atrioventricular valve, and this is your left atrioventricular valve. The big difference between them are these little stringy things that are attached to the tricuspid and the bicuspid valves. And there is a muscle that these little stringy things are attached to. These semilunar valves do not have any of those little strings, and they don't have a muscle that they're attached to. So the little strings are known as your chordae tendineae, or your heartstrings. So if you ever tell somebody that you're tugging on my heartstrings, it's not very nice because you could cause prolapse. It's not good. Don't tug on anybody's heartstrings. Those heartstrings are attached to these little muscles on the ventricular wall known as papillary muscles. I'll show you a better image of them, but these papillary muscles kind of look like finger-like projections, and they contract on those heartstrings to pull down that atrioventricular valve to let blood into each of these ventricles. Okay, so you are required to know the papillary muscles, and you are required to know chordae tendineae. You will get partial credit if you mention heartstrings rather than chordae tendineae. All right, the other thing, I want to give you guys a little hint here. If you don't want to memorize the right and left atrioventricular valve, and you want to memorize tricuspid and bicuspid, and if you're having a hard time like, is this the bicuspid valve or is this the tricuspid valve? Okay, well, we know that blood enters on the right side first and then it goes into the left side next, right? So the way you can memorize these two valves is you want to try before you buy. You're welcome. Okay. Next up, let's go to the next slide here. All right, we are now looking at the inside of the heart from the anterior view. So what is this green arrow pointing to right here? This is your right atrium, correct. So what is that purple one talking to or pointing to? That is your left atrium. What is that yellow arrow pointing to? That is your right ventricle, and that is your left ventricle. That yellow arrow is pointing to that valve. Try before you buy. You are correct. This is the tricuspid valve, or the right atrioventricular valve. That red arrow is pointing to the bicuspid valve, or the left atrioventricular valve. That pinkish magenta arrow is pointing, so notice, this might be a little tricky, notice that this canal right here is not associated with this ventricle, it's more associated with the right ventricle. So when deoxygenated blood leaves the right ventricle, it is going to go up and is going to pass through a valve right here. This valve is your pulmonary semilunar valve, and then it leaves via the pulmonary artery, which I thought was going to be labeled there. Okay, so just a little closer. This is your tricuspid valve. This is your bicuspid valve. Okay, remember I mentioned that the heartstrings are attached to these finger-like projections, these muscles. These are your papillary muscles. These papillary muscles attach to the chordae tendineae here. And then there is another muscle in the ventricles known as your trabeculae carneae. That is a term on the list in your lab manual. If anybody was interested in knowing what the trabeculae carneae is, that's what that is right there, although you are not required to know that for the exam. We're not going to ask you to identify the trabeculae carneae. Okay, this might be a harder view. This is the anterior view of the heart, but now we're focusing on the left side. So that magenta arrow is pointing to the pulmonary semilunar valve right there. Is there an arrow for it? There might be an arrow, but this is your pulmonary artery that's taking deoxygenated blood away from the heart and going to the lungs. This valve right here is your aortic semilunar valve, which will then go into your aorta right here and thus taking blood to the rest of the body. These are your pulmonary arteries taking deoxygenated blood to the lungs. These yellow arrows right here are going to be your pulmonary veins bringing blood into that left ventricle in here. This blue arrow is pointing to the aorta. Okay, so before I move into that, everything's fine and dandy when we're looking at a model, but this is not actually how hearts look in person. So let's try practicing that on an actual heart, because when we test you guys, we want you guys to be familiar with a dissected heart. So you guys should be familiar with dissected hearts. Okay, so this is the frontal view of the heart. This heart was cut in half. And when I say frontal view of the heart, this is the anterior view here. On the other side of this over here would have been the anterior view. So this was cut in half. So this right here is the right side of the heart, and this is the left side of the heart. This is the right side of the heart, and this is the left side of the heart. Well, how can I tell? It's because of how thick this wall is in comparison to how thick this wall is. This is your left ventricle right here, and this is your right ventricle right here. There is another landmark I have not mentioned yet that you guys are required to know. Let me change my pen color. Let's do yellow this time. This wall right here in the middle that separates the right side from the left side is known as your interventricular septum. Partial points if you just give a septum, full points if you say interventricular septum. Okay? All right, so let's practice pointing out some landmarks here. What these are pointing to, so let's start on the right side of the heart. This is pointing to the tricuspid valve or the right atrioventricular valve. This red arrow is pointing to the bicuspid valve. Remember, you want to try before you buy. So this is the bicuspid valve on the left side of the heart. Then these yellow arrows are pointing to the papillary muscles. These papillary muscles are attached to what this purple arrow is pointing to. This is your chordae tendineae or your heartstrings. These are attached to both the tricuspid and the bicuspid valve. Where this pin is right here, this is the aortic semilunar valve. Once oxygenated blood passes through that aortic semilunar valve, it then exits the heart via the aorta. And then these blue arrows are pointing to those muscles, the trabeculae carneae. Again, don't really worry so much about that. Okay, this red arrow, again, pointing to that bicuspid valve, that left atrioventricular valve. These yellow arrows are pointing to the papillary muscles which attach to those heartstrings, the trabeculae carneae. And then, oh, sorry, not trabeculae carneae. Sorry, mistake there. This is your chordae tendineae. Trabeculae carneae is going to be the muscles that are down here. So this is your chordae tendineae. Quiz yourself. Now go watch the dissection video. It's going to take a lot of repetition to really get the steps of how blood moves through the heart, to really memorize all those landmarks of the heart and the regions that we want you to be familiar with. So please come to office hours, ask us questions. If you need help learning how to study for this, ask us. All right, good luck, everybody.